Good evening. Fires are burning across large parts of London tonight.
Major disturbances at Tottenham in North London. The trouble erupted after a protest at the fatal shooting of a man by police which turned violent.
The looting of London was on an industrial scale. Houses and flats across the capital and other cities have been filled with an extraordinary haul of goods.
In August 2011, England experienced the largest outbreak of rioting in a generation. The disorder began after the shooting of a young man, Mark Duggan, by police officers in Tottenham. A protest 2 days later morphed into larger disorder. Over the next 3 days, riots spread rapidly across London and then to other urban centres in England. In total, there was an estimated 5 deaths, 200 injuries, 3,000 arrests, and over £200 million worth of property damage. Welcome to LSE IQ. I'm James Ritty, and this is the podcast where we ask social scientists and other experts to answer one intelligent question. In this episode of LSE IQ, I ask, what can we learn from the 2011 riots? Tim Newburn, Professor of Criminology and Social Policy at LSE, co-wrote a major report called Reading the Riots. He began by telling me where he was when the riots began.
So the riots occurred in August 2011, and like a lot of people, including the Prime Minister, the Mayor of London, the Home Secretary, and a number of others, I share almost nothing else with them. I was on holiday. The news came through, and almost immediately my phone started to go with journalists wanting to talk, wanting quotes. I was obviously on in various kind of books as a criminologist who might know something about these kinds of things, or at least might give a quote.
So what was the initial trigger for the riots?
I think there are two things that would ordinarily be alighted on as the sort of triggers or flashpoints or whatever the kind of metaphor one wants. The first was the shooting of Mark Duggan, a young black man, shot by the Metropolitan Police on a Thursday. He was travelling in a taxi. The taxi was stopped, confronted by Met police officers, and in the ensuing conflict, he was shot and killed. As is typical of those kinds of events, a huge number of claims and counterclaims were made about Mark Duggan and about what had happened. So in terms of his character, he was variously portrayed as, in inverted commas, a gangster, as involved in the drugs trade, as having been armed. It was suggested that not only did he have a gun, but he fired on the police, that one police officer had narrowly escaped injury and so forth.
Covered from the scene, and that they understood the officer was shot before Mark Duggan was killed. However, Mr. Duggan's family claimed that he was shot in the face by police after running from a minicab and leaving his gun behind.
His family, friends, others in the local community, obviously were not only extraordinarily upset by the incident itself and the death, but also very much antagonised by the claims that were being made, and very much disputed the idea that he was either armed or had shot on the police. And matters subsequently have shown that it seems neither of those things were the case. There was a firearm found near the taxi, but no suggestion he'd had it in his hands, and absolutely none that it had been shot or used. That's the backdrop. A sort of day and a half, 2 days later, family and others stage a march from the Broadwater Farm estate in Tottenham to the local police station, demanding answers, as well as to stage a symbolic protest. What happened then, I think, is subject to dispute, but what seems indisputable, certainly from the point of view of the protesters themselves, is that it wasn't well handled.
The vacuum of uncertainty prompted the demonstration. They wanted answers. Tottenham police didn't have them. Worse still, they waited in hope. They were told the police commissioner was on his way, but he never arrived.
They felt disrespected, that there wasn't an officer of sufficient seniority to deal with their requests, their complaints, their desire for information and so on. But in the handling of the crowd outside the police station, there was one specific incident where it appears a young woman was pushed to the ground by a police officer, just inflaming the tensions that were already raised. And it was from that, really, that I think the kind of initial violence grew, the initial destruction grew, and then slowly but surely escalated into the thing that we now know as the initial rioting in Haringey on the Saturday.
The Guardian journalist Paul Lewis was at home in Stoke Newington, just south of Tottenham, on the Saturday the riot started.
The windows of my flat were open and I kept hearing police sirens going past, and which is not an abnormal thing on a Saturday night in Stoke Newington, but over time it was just the intensity of it, and I was just kind of like, well, that's a lot of police cars, what's going on? And after about an hour, I remember looking at my phone and looking at Twitter and seeing that someone had tweeted a picture of a police car on fire. And, you know, I'm a journalist and, you know, to some degree you follow your nose with these things. And so I decided to go along. I actually took my wife because it was a Saturday night and she and I were hanging out together. So we were going to go to the pub, and instead I took her to this riot.
Date night.
Pardon?
Date night.
Date night, yeah, it's a date night. You know, I remember first arriving and police had sort of cordoned off a section of the high street, and you could see that in the background there were missiles coming and there was some fires, and we walked around the edge and I just saw people, you know, dozens and dozens of people carrying hi-fis, TVs, electrical equipment, and my reaction, my assumption was that people were clearing their houses because of the fire. And then it suddenly dawned on me that actually this was looting. And I'd never seen looting before. In fact, I don't know if there had ever been systematic looting of that kind in my lifetime in the UK. And it was at that point that I realised this was something that was quite a moment and unusual, and I stayed. Another memory I had from the night was talking to some kids on a side street, and they were showing me these BlackBerry messages, and there was all sorts of conspiracies flying around about the death of Mark Duggan. That he'd been executed, that he'd been shot through the back of the head. Some of the concerns that were going around at the time turned out to be warranted about the family not being given answers and the hesitancy on the part of police to talk to them. So I stayed with the riots throughout the night in Tottenham. I got to bed. I think I went home and then I got on my bike. My wife went to bed and I looked at my phone and the riots were spreading, and they were sort of spreading at that time west. And because a lot of the roads were blocked off, I thought the best way to get around would be on my bike. So I got my bicycle and I would basically just cycle around watching what was happening until about dawn the next day. And then I got up, started reporting again, and then continued through the day, barely any sleep. And then the rioting began for the second night, in Edmonton and Enfield and Brixton. And then the next night again, basically the third night, London was on fire. I think I'm right in saying around sort of 26 of London's 32 boroughs saw rioting, and in some places extremely serious and intense. And of course that night it also spread to Birmingham and Nottingham and Liverpool and Manchester and Salford.
After 3 nights of unbridled lawlessness across London, the contagion is spreading, not only to new areas of the capital, but now to regional cities too, though it's London where the worst of the violence, looting and vandalism is happening.
Professor John Drury is lecturer of social psychology at the University of Sussex. Alongside Roger Ball, Fergus Neville, Stephen Riker and Clifford Scott, John has recently published a report entitled Rereading the 2011 English Riots. One of the report's objectives was to explain why the riots moved from Tottenham to other areas.
What was apparent in the 2011 riots was the question of spread, right? How did one riot in Tottenham become dozens of riots across the country? How is that possible? Psychologically, that hadn't really been addressed before.
Much of the initial speculation focused on the use of social media. Tim Newburn.
The thing that did play a part was BlackBerry Messenger. And that was used a lot.
At the time, all teenagers had BlackBerries. There were these things, some of your listeners will remember, BBM messages, which were these encrypted messages that were being sent around BlackBerry phones.
Here's an interview with some rioters from the BBC's Newsnight.
There was tons of messages coming through to everybody. Everybody's phone was buzzing off.
Rioting's taken place in Tottenham, Lewisham, Peckham, Brixton.
If I knew that my friends were coming back but there was police coming, I could have warned them straight away. So it was a very useful little gadget that we had at the time.
Wasn't there an impulse to shut it down? Wasn't that
yeah, there was talk about, this is, in retrospect, so bizarre. At that time, maybe there were elements in the public who want a sort of get tough response, and one of those was, well, we'll consider trying to shut down Facebook in moments like these.
The Reading the Rights report sought to test the effect of social media by examining the contents of riot-related tweets.
We asked the company Twitter, and they agreed to give us a data set of millions of riot-related tweets so we could analyse them. And actually what we found out was more often than not, the tweeting came after the rioting, so to speak, and people were using social media to disprove some of the false stories that were flying around. And that would go from everything from I remember there's a picture of the London Eye on fire, which was just, superimposed, and it was ridiculous. The London Eye is made of steel, but this did the rounds. There was another rumour that McDonald's had been broken into and rioters were making their own food. That rumour actually made it into the Daily Mail. And there was the third, I remember, that London Zoo had been broken into and the animals had been released, and people were photoshopping pictures of penguins around London streets.
This was, on one level, this was a kind of classic media moral panic, I think. It's everything from the penny dreadful through the video nasties to everything. Every time there's a new technology, there's a new set of respectable fears, as they've been called. And this was another example of that. But there's a tendency, I think, in political discourse to conflate or elide communication with cause. Had the Prime Minister tried or been able to switch off various platforms, then it might have made communication more difficult, and it would undoubtedly have affected the movement of people in various ways. Would it have stopped the riots? I don't think so.
You get the same debate in social movement theory, actually, because they say, well, is it that the new media, the new technology is transforming social movements? And people like Manuel Castells, they end up saying, well, no, it's a quantitative thing rather than a qualitative thing.
What do you mean by quantitative rather than quantitative?
Well, it speeds things up. It makes things faster. The knowledge spreads more quickly, the word spreads more quickly. There's not a difference in the type of things people do, it's a difference in how quickly they do them.
So if social media was not the motivating factor, what was? People from across the political spectrum gave contrasting explanations. Here's hip-hop artist and writer Akala talking about the representation of Mark Duggan to Russia Today.
With Mark Duggan, there was the famous thing where the media ran a picture where he had a really somber and upset look on his face. And we found out they'd cut out a heart that he was holding. He was stood at his daughter's grave. Think about the profoundness of that. This man was stood at the grave of his child, mourning, and the media cut out essentially it's like a flower box he was holding, and just showed the top face where he looks. He's obviously got a scowl on his face. In a society like this, in a society built on private property, to be poor is a crime. To be poor and black is especially a crime. And so those narratives are birthed out of this set of ideologies where to give a profound counterbalance, where the Norwegian terrorist a few years ago who killed 78 people, or the pilot of that German wings flight who deliberately crashed 150 people into the side of a mountain because they're white, are portrayed with more humanity in the media than teenage black victims of state murder.
Right-wing opinions were markedly different. Here's then Prime Minister David Cameron, followed by then Home Secretary Theresa May.
These are sickening scenes of people looting, vandalising, thieving, robbing. This is criminality, pure and simple, and it has to be confronted and defeated.
The disorder this summer wasn't about poverty or politics. It was about greed and criminality fueled by a culture of irresponsibility and entitlement. To those who say the judges were too tough, I say the guilty should get what they deserve.
Whatever your pre-existing beliefs were, you would sort of imprint those upon the riots and come up with an explanation. So, people on the right would say it was, family breakdown, or Cameron's term, criminality pure and simple, or it was just simple lawlessness, or it was opportunism. And on the left, it was viewed more in terms of, this is the early onset consequences of austerity. This is a form of protest. It's to do with political injustice. It's to do with inequality. It's to do, some people were arguing with the introduction of tuition fees or cuts to social services, particularly youth services. So it was around that time that, I asked around and did some reading, and it was evident that Tim Newburn at the LSE was, pretty much the leading scholar in this domain. And I just phoned him up.
About maybe a week or so afterwards, I got a telephone call from a journalist, Paul Lewis at The Guardian, saying that, they'd collected a huge amount of data on the riots. They were wondering what to do with it, but they were also thinking of doing some further research, and might we, the LSE, be interested? And I was. So from about September to late November, we interviewed about 270 rioters, collected this huge quantity of data, analysed it, and then published it all in the newspaper in early December. So a really quick piece of social science, and unusual, unique, really, I think.
Are riots a particularly good kind of sociological kind of case study for understanding a society at large, its problems, its issues?
I would argue that focusing on these kinds of social phenomena are a really good window onto social life, from wherever it might be, from London to Hong Kong umbrella movement to Tahrir Square to everywhere else. What you're really looking at is, at the broadest structural level, the political, social and economic formation and the way in which that links to outbreaks of urban violence. How order isn't maintained.
Then UK Independence Party leader Nigel Farage dismissed the riots as being apolitical and purely opportunistic.
I very well remember 30 years ago the Brixton Riots. I lived very close to Brixton at the time. And if you remember, there was a cause, there was a reason. The black community were absolutely furious with the police over what were then called the sus laws. And it led to a change in the law, and I think many of us thought that London and our inner cities were safer places. What is happening here has got nothing to do with any political reason whatsoever. There are no demands coming from the rioters or protesters. This is just opportunistic crime taking place on an absolutely massive scale.
Other riots seem to have, or be conceived of by the media in more kind of political terms, whereas this was considered to be entirely apolitical, immoral.
Well, that's true, but they say that every single time. In 1985 they said, oh well, the riots in 1981, they had a good cause, but look, these are gratuitous. Look at how many buildings they burnt. I tell you, they burnt far more buildings in the 1980s than they did in 2011, but every single time they say the same thing. Oh, there were riots are much better in my day, these days they're just, or they're after his trainers.
So there's nostalgia for riots.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. What reasoning did the then London Mayor, now Prime Minister, Boris Johnson give?
There's a range of things, aren't there? There's pure criminality. As I say, 86% have previous convictions. There's a lust for excitement, there's greed, there's copycat stuff, there's Me Tooism. But what it gives us, I think, as I say, is an opportunity to deal with some of the real problems we got in London and indeed in other big cities with gangs, because there's no doubt about it, it was the gangs who were leading off the problem and who are leading off the assaults on the shops.
John Drury's research questions some of these assertions, including Boris Johnson's claim regarding the percentage of rioters with previous criminal convictions.
Well, the problem with the evidence used by the government in this case was that they relied upon initial arrest figures, and they found that the profile of the initial number of people who'd been arrested following the riots was very similar to those appearing in the courts anyway. So it's the same people we always see. But of course what that neglected was the fact that because the police were under pressure, the police had gone out and targeted known people, right? So it's a kind of artifact of their initial strategy, which is understandable. They were under pressure, they had to go to where they thought they'd get arrests, and they'd arrested people with criminal records already. And so these were people that had been arrested. They weren't people that were were convicted, they were people that had been arrested, so it was a circular thing. And that can be easily knocked back. I mean, the other claim they made, of course, was that it was all orchestrated by gangs, which they retreated from very soon after making it because, again, the evidence didn't support it.
By the Monday, an increased show of force by the police was beginning to restore order. The government's hardline approach was also reflected in the punitive sentences of rioters, even for minor offences. The average sentence length was 17 months. Paul Lewis recalls a moment he experienced on the first night of looting.
Stories after the riots about the length of sentences people were getting for what seemed like relatively trivial behaviour. And one of the stories that people talk about was someone who'd stolen a bottle of water from a shop. And I can't remember what they received him with. Maybe it was like a 6-month sentence or something. But it just seemed like such a trivial act. And I often think about that because I remember being in the midst of the riot on the first night, sort of 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, being desperately thirsty. And outside one of these shops, one of the shop owners had used sort of stacks of bottles of water almost as a sort of barricade for the glass outside of their window. And obviously these had been sort of knocked on the floor and spread across the pavement. And I remember being sort of quite tempted because it just seemed like it was just sprawled across the floor, and why wouldn't you? I was really, really thirsty. And sometimes I just thought, what if I picked up a bottle of water and lo and behold, I'm sort of grabbed from behind by a police officer.
The language used to describe rioting has many connotations. Tim Newburn believes the word riot itself can be problematic.
The word riot is a problematic one, okay, because it means different things to different people. It's often used pejoratively, and it's used pejoratively in the sense that it encourages us to think about disorder simply in terms of the violence. So if there is a kind of political undercurrent, the term riot kind of evacuates the disorder of its political content. This is a complex social phenomenon.
John Drury has looked closely at the use of another word, contagion, and how it's repeatedly used to describe how riots spread. He argues contagion is a damaging and misleading term with a long history.
If one looks at the history of this, you start to get a sense of what is wrong with it. The most important early use in a social science context was from the early crowd scientists in the late 19th century, who sought not only to understand the crowds in late 19th century France, who were seen by them as privileged gentlemen to be a threat to their society, a threat to civilization, but they also sought to combat this threat. And part of their way of doing that was to create this science which not only pathologized the crowd, but also, in the case of Gustave Le Bon, for example, suggested various techniques to harness it and combat it and control it. And contagion was one of those words they used to convey that social influence in a crowd is mindless, that it's like a disease, that it's bad, that it has no boundaries. So any sentiment or behaviour sweeps through a crowd, said Le Bon, just like a disease, and people are completely uncritical. Now this then became more popular in a few years later through the social sciences to describe all sorts of behaviour, not just crowd behaviour, but consumer behaviour, emotions, all sorts of things. And it gives you the idea that it's bad, it's like an illness. And it does seem to be always linked with violence and with crowds as well. That is why we want to kind of develop an alternative, because of that baggage.
So what is that alternative?
Well, first of all, neutrally one can talk about spread, and then to explain that spread you need a theory of influence. So statistically you can show that, this is what a lot of people have done in this area, they've shown that the likelihood of a riot happening in one location is increased by the size of a riot in another location previously, and the locality of it, and so on, the intensity of it. All these things are predictors. So then you've got spread, right, just simply descriptively. And then you can say, well, psychologically, for that to happen, then there must be some kind of influence, right? So that's another kind of neutral term. And then you need a theory of that influence. How does that work? And the concepts, and then you can either talk about contagion and say it's mindless, and then you predict, well, anyone who hears about the thing is going to be influenced. So, then empirically, contagion is not useful, as well as ideologically. So our alternative is in terms of identity and empowerment. The role of identity is to specify who we listen to or who we take notice of. And then empowerment, because it's not enough just to hear about it, you need to get the sense that other people like you will act the same way. So what we found when we looked at South London was people expected their peer groups, their networks, their neighbours to join in, right? And it was the influence of other people like me locally that actually got most people in the interviews to get involved, because then they felt, I can do it, right? I can do it because I'm going to be supported, because my friends and neighbours are going to be around me. I'm not going to be alone.
The idea then that the riots were the actions of a barbaric, unthinking mass is incorrect. The Reading the Riots report sought to find evidence-based conclusions about what the riots were like and what their underlying causes were. Tim Newburn.
The thing that comes shining through the interviews with a lot of the rioters, at least initially, is a real sense of carnival. What happens is, a bit of violence breaks out, everyone's having a bit of a go, they're giving expression to, all sorts of a sense of sort of anger and frustration and so on. But actually, partly, among all the other things they're doing, having a great time on the streets, burning a car, throwing a few bricks, shouting some whatever at whoever, running around, kicking off. It's a lot of fun for a while. It doesn't last, the fun, but, it's that emotional kind of sense of freedom, I think, is not to be discounted.
People don't always think this about a riot, and I've actually been in several riots since then, both in the US and elsewhere. I was in Baltimore in the Ferguson riots, and they have a real festive atmosphere. It can look incredibly threatening on the television, but when you're in the midst of it, you get the sense that for many of the people who are taking part, it's almost joyous, it's intoxicating. There's this sort of febrile atmosphere that everything is suddenly let loose, and there's a lot of cooperation that goes on the ground.
But it also has to be understood in the context of the lives of the kinds of folk who are drawn to it, which is actually what we're talking about, not entirely, but oftentimes, is in many cases young people whose lives are incredibly constrained, who have very few opportunities, who are failing at school, whose prospects are poor, whose lives actually are kind of evacuated of enjoyment, fun, opportunity, the kinds of things that the wealthier might take for granted. And so that's another reason why this becomes a moment of excitement, a kind of turning of the tables on authorities and so forth.
Here are some of the writers interviewed on ITV News. They are asked about what they looted and why.
I done this basically to provide for my family, and I got some stuff for my son, and I got some stuff for me, like some clothes, trainers.
You're 16 years old, but you were getting stuff for your son?
Yeah, I had to get some stuff for him.
So what did you get for him?
I got him clothes, I got him nappies, powder, the whole Johnson set.
You were all out together, weren't you?
Yeah. I got some TVs as well, plasmas, PS3, laptops and stuff, innit?
It's the government's fault. Yeah. I don't know.
Conservatives.
Yeah, whatever who it is, I don't know.
It's not even a right, it's showing the police we can do what we want.
Yeah, that's what it's all about, showing the police we can do what we want.
You went to the stores that you'd applied for a job at?
Yeah. I went across, I even went to Clapham, to go where I handed out a CV. I was like, you didn't want to reply back to an email, or I come up here with my CV. I was like, this is payback, isn't it? Payback, boy.
Which store did you go for in Clapham that you'd applied for a job at?
Comet,
the electrical place.
Has the research shown who the writers were and what motivated them? Building on the Reading the Riots data, John Drury and his team have been able to identify two key predictors of whether an area was more likely to riot.
There are different ways of measuring deprivation, and in each case it predicts whether a riot occurred in a local area. The other thing we looked at is stop and search. We found that stop and search, and again, whichever way you measure it comes out the same way, that stop and search is a significant predictor of whether rioting occurs.
The extremely poor relationships with the police obviously kind of then focused on the death of Mark Duggan, but more broadly around the long-standing problems that those communities or those people some of them at least, had with the police. These are long-term historical problems. The antagonistic relationships are ones between the police and the community quite generally. Secondly, I think these are kind of quite targeted feelings as well, so that young people of all ethnicities find themselves in situations where they feel targeted, abused, mistreated by the police, not least through things like the most symbolic, obvious thing is stop and search, and the unreasonable, the rude, the disproportionate, aggressive use of stop and search as a tactic. But I think more generally, the police for many are perceived in those communities as as an invading force, as an army of occupation almost. And I mean, one of the claims that was made by the Home Secretary specifically at the time about the riots was that what had gone on, what we'd seen, was somehow a reflection of the problem of gangs in our urban environment. Now, actually, it turned out there was no evidence of that at all. And indeed, the interviews that we did, and we did a lot of interviews, the main time the word gang was used was in relation to the police. They were described by people as the biggest gang. That's how they were perceived. And it's that sense, I think, that drives the kind of antagonism and hostility which was partially at least given expression in the violence of the riots.
And if you look at the footage, you could see, I mean, the looting's an example of this. I mean, a lot of the looting was in fact coordinated in the sense that people were cooperating with each other. And we know from the interviews that, some of this was with strangers. So at some level, there's a kind of shared understanding that we're a we, we're an us. But what is the content of that? Well, we could say the anti-police element was a significant part, and I think, if you didn't have the anti-police element, you wouldn't have got the riots. Not everybody had experience of stop and search, and I think Tim's data shows that most of his sample did, but you don't need to have that as an individual. I mean, I think one of the things that we found was people talked about stop and search and other what they saw as police harassment as something against them collectively.
Irrespective of whether the rioter was in Manchester or Nottingham or London, is a feeling that there was a pre-existing sense of grievance about their relationship with police in these communities. And sometimes, although not always, that was expressed through experiences of stop and search, but it just kept coming back to the analysts. And I'm not saying that was the only thing they discovered, and there was a whole host of different findings. As with all of these sort of social phenomena, it's incredibly complicated, and there's an interrelationship between all these different factors.
But did this shared animosity towards the police, and in particular the Mark Duggan shooting, act as a motivating factor for the rioters in all the areas, including those in other cities?
There are common threads that make their way, for example, from Tottenham to Brixton. Was that then kind of replicated on a wider scale, like when they moved to Croydon and then outside of London to other city centres?
Mostly not. In fact, there were more people in Croydon and Clapham saying, no, I didn't get involved because of Mark Duggan. More people saying that than saying they did get involved because of Mark Duggan. So what is the other motivation? What is the other effect, if you like? And from looking at the data, it didn't seem as if they were mostly being directly influenced by Tottenham. They were more influenced by the totality of riots that had happened, because this is day 3, remember. The totality of riots that had happened by then, which told them that the police, the common enemy, was defeated, right? So in fact, it wasn't a kind of direct identification with Tottenham or Brixton. It was a more kind of indirect identification, having a recognition of a shared enemy, right, being vulnerable. And that allowed them to act upon that to do all sorts of things, including a lot more looting. And that's why you got a lot more looting in the later days than you did in the early days. The early days tended to be more anti-police, and as the riots developed, they became more looting oriented once the police had been defeated and were seen to be vulnerable.
I mean, I have had, just very recently, a woman very persuasively said to me, they say, why did we break into these shops? She said, well, do you want to know how I'm treated when I go into one of these stores by the security guards? They follow me around like I'm suspicious. They act effectively like law enforcement. Now that was her argument, and when she argued it, I actually found it quite a compelling case. But I'm also aware that sometimes some commentators, I think, take this argument too far and argue that there is a degree of symbolism in some of this activity that may not always, ring true when you talk to the people who were actually involved in some of this. But I remember talking to Tim and the analysts about how this finding with respect to police really stood out to them. And, we took their lead, and that became, what we would sort of say was our top line. And it was proved to be a controversial one. I don't think it was necessarily what, senior police officers wanted us to find. I didn't get the sense from the Home Secretary at the time, who was Theresa May, was that it was a finding that she wanted us to find. But, we were led by what we found in the research.
So, what impact did the Reading the Riots report have on policymaking? Tim Newburn.
The one dramatic impact it did have was on Theresa May, who came along to our conference in December 2011 and announced a big shift on stop and search. And didn't claim for a moment that we were the only ones by any means who brought that about. But I think the public profile of the riots, reading the riots research with The Guardian, helped to stimulate, helped to focus attention on that. More widely? No, absolutely not. I mean, if one looks at, for example, the public policy response to the riots, what would you say it was? Well, I think the answer is there wasn't any. The coalition government and the subsequent Conservative government, the only thing they did of any substance that had any link with the riots was something called the Troubled Families Programme, which was a huge government initiative, Cameron initiative, essentially, to target money and resources on what were seen to be the most troublesome families, those essentially who take up the greater part of public services. And the theory being that if you concentrated services around them, you'd have a disproportionate impact on various public problems. And that was it, pretty much. There was a low-level public inquiry, which did very little and everyone then forgot about. And unfortunately and sadly, I think, the research, though I think people continue to talk about it, so it's had a low-level, ongoing, small effect on our sense and memory of these things. In terms of any more dramatic impact, I don't think we could claim it at all.
8 years on, where are we? I know that you did as well as doing this research, you had an event at the beginning of the year, which I presume had community members from Tottenham as well. Yeah. So both from a kind of top-down policy level and looking on the ground as well. Where do you think we are now? Have we learnt any lessons from the riots?
Well, I think some of us have, but I don't think the government have. And I think many of the factors that were at play just before the riots of 2011 are still there now. I mean, stop and search still exists. They're talking about increasing it.
We will give greater powers to the police to use stop and search to help tackle violent crime.
It's been shown to be racist still. Deprivation isn't getting any better. I'm not sure about attitudes to policing getting any better. And then, of course, what you would need on top of that for a riot to occur is an event which crystallises those concerns, such as the killing of a member of the public, where there is community support for that member of the public, that we could get the same conditions again. I mean, another issue, of course, and this was happening in 2011, is people being on the streets. It happened in the summer anyway, of course. Why do you get more riots in summers? Because people are on the streets. But they're especially going to be on the streets if they're young people and there are no youth facilities, right? And that was something that came up then. And I don't think they've opened more youth clubs since then. I think it's the same situation. Those young people are still on the streets. So I'm afraid the same factors are still there.
Politicians very quickly confuse or link or elide understanding with excusing. They think that if you endeavour to make sense of and understand what goes on in something like a riot, and do more than just say, as David Cameron did, this is criminality pure and simple, then you're somehow excusing the behaviour of those who were involved. Whereas it seems to me it's perfectly possible to do both. I can both say that I think that the things that many people got up to on the streets of London and Manchester, Salford, Liverpool, etc., on those 4 days in August 2011 were appalling. But on the other hand, if you look at their lives, their anger, their frustration, what you see is poor, impoverished, disenfranchised communities with precious little hope actually getting worse. And by forgetting the riots, that amnesia allows those conditions to fester, to worsen, and so forth. The question of why riots don't happen, I think, is a more interesting one, and arguably a more difficult one, than why they do. There's no sense that I think riots are going to happen tomorrow or this summer, but equally there's no sense they're not. Retrospectively, I think we can kind of diagnose, but the diagnosis doesn't allow us any prognostication. It doesn't allow us to look forward at all. We can't predict.
One positive thing one can take from this is to think differently about riots. I mean, when we did this community event in Tottenham, and again the event we did in Parliament, invited by Diane Abbott, some people who took part were there. And they said, yes, what is missing from the discourse is, in fact, even though it began through a tragedy, which is somebody being killed, and even though it involved a lot of pain for a lot of people, in fact, there were some exhilarating, empowering experiences for a lot of people who overturned power relations and for the first time felt in control of their lives. I mean, Tim's research has documented this well, how prevalent this theme of joy and empowerment is in the experiences of participants to have, created that power reversal. And that's never talked about because, again, there's this kind of stigma about talking about anything positive to do with riots. Yet it's true, because in everyday life we are, often atomised, powerless individuals, but in a crowd we have the power to shape our world.
The Reading the Riots report was an innovative collaboration between journalism and academia and helped replace conjecture and belief with research and evidence. Here's Paul Lewis from The Guardian talking about what he learned from the project.
But it also changed the way that I do my job. My technique for interviewing has never been the same since the Reading the Riots project. The process of conducting non-leading interviews, where you try to get an interviewee to talk to you in an open, as transparent way as possible, it's just an incredibly effective journalistic tool. At its essence, the objective of journalism is not that distinct from academia. I mean, maybe it has more distorting influences. Academics don't have advertisers. There's an element of journalism which is about entertainment, beautiful writing, engaging stories. But at its essence, we're trying to find out about the world. There is a point where social research and journalism can meet one another, and for a few months in 2011, we did that, and I'm really pleased we did. People like to say, have you heard this phrase, journalism is the first draft of history? Mm-hmm. And I feel like we went beyond that. It was a second or third draft.
Tell us what you think using the hashtag LSE IQ. This episode of LSE IQ was produced by James Ritty. Want to explore the issue of writing in more depth? The episode was based in part on the following research. Reading the Riots by Paul Lewis, Tim Newburn, Matthew Taylor, Catriona McGlivery, Asta Greenhill, Harold Freeman, and Rob Proctor. Rereading the Riots, ESRC Beyond Contagion's interim report by John Drury, Roger Ball, Fergus Neville, Stephen Riker and Clifford Scott. Join us next time when we ask, is the 21st century the Chinese century? For more episodes of this podcast and to subscribe, please visit lse.ac.uk/IQ or search for LSE